The stars had always seemed beautiful to the people of Earth. But on that terrible night 300 years ago, they became a source of death and horror that would never be forgotten by those who survived high above the blue planet. Massive ships hung in the darkness like sleeping giants, and inside those ships, the Valkyrie commanders watched the world below with cold and uncaring eyes as they prepared to commit an act so evil that it would echo through the centuries. The Valkyrie were an ancient race, rulers of a vast empire that stretched across 47 star systems and held power over 200 different species who lived in fear of their might and cruelty. They had discovered Earth during a routine exploration mission, and what they found had troubled the oracles, who could see glimpses of possible futures through their strange and mysterious powers. These humans are dangerous, the lead oracle had told the High Council in a voice that carried the weight of terrible certainty. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday they will rise to challenge everything we have built over 10,000 years of conquest and expansion. The High Council had listened carefully, and Grand Adjudicator Vethaner had made the decision that would seal the fate of billions with nothing more than a simple wave of his clawed hand. Then we shall remove them from the equation before they become a problem, he had declared without a trace of emotion or remorse in his alien voice. Release the silence plague upon their world and let nature take its course until none remain. The bioweapon was elegant in its cruelty, designed by Valkyrie scientists who had perfected the art of genocide over thousands of years of practice on other unfortunate species who had caught the attention of the Empire. It spread through the air like an invisible ghost, passing from person to person with every breath and every touch until there was nowhere left to hide from its deadly embrace. The first symptoms appeared within weeks as people across every continent began to fall sick with fevers that burned like fire and coughs that tore their lungs apart from the inside. Hospitals overflowed with the dying and the dead as doctors worked without sleep to find a cure that did not exist and could not be found because the plague had been designed by minds far more advanced than any on Earth. The be designed by minds far more advanced than any on Earth. Valkyrie watched from orbit and recorded everything, with the detached interest of scientists observing an experiment, making notes about how quickly the population declined, and how the primitive humans reacted to their impending extinction. Fascinating, one Valkyrie researcher had remarked as cities fell silent, and mass graves were dug across every nation. They continue to fight even when there is no hope remaining for their species. Billions died in the first year alone as the plague swept across the globe without mercy or discrimination, taking the young and the old, the rich and the poor, the strong and the weak with equal cruelty. Governments collapsed under the weight of so much death and despair, and civilization itself began to crumble as the survivors fought over dwindling resources and watched their loved ones die in their arms. But the Valkyrie had made a mistake that would cost them everything in the centuries to come, for they had underestimated the stubborn will to survive that burned in the hearts of humanity. Deep beneath the Andes Mountains, a group of scientists and military leaders had sealed themselves inside a bunker that had been built to survive nuclear war, and they watched in horror as the world above them died in Antarctica. A research station buried under miles of ice became a refuge for those lucky enough to reach it before the plague claimed them, and they huddled together in the frozen darkness and swore to endure. And far from Earth, a colony ship carrying 10,000 people limped toward a distant star called Proxima Centauri, having launched just days before the plague arrived with nothing but hope and desperation to fuel their journey. The Valkyrie checked their sensors one final time when the human population had fallen below 50 million scattered survivors, and they deemed their mission a complete success worthy of celebration. Archive this operation under Preemptive Pacification Protocol 7. The fleet commander had ordered as he prepared to leave Earth behind forever. Another potential threat has been neutralized for the good of the hegemony. The ships turned away from the dying world and vanished into the stars, never bothering to confirm that humanity had actually gone extinct, because why would they waste resources on such an obviously doomed species? This was their greatest error, and it would haunt them for centuries to come, in the bunkers and the ice stations and the cramped corridors of the colony ship. The survivors gathered what strength remained to them and began the long and painful process of rebuilding from the ashes of their civilization. They recovered Velthory transmissions that had been intercepted during the attack, and they learned the truth about what had been done to them and why their people had been murdered by aliens who saw them as nothing more than insects to be exterminated. A young woman named Elena Tanaka stood before the survivors in the Andes bunker on the first anniversary of the plague, and she spoke words that would become sacred to every generation that followed. "We will remember every name of every person we have lost," she declared, with tears streaming down her face and fire burning in her eyes. "We will rebuild our civilization stronger than it ever was before, and we will make those who did this to us pay a price so terrible that the galaxy will speak of it in whispers for 10,000 years. The survivors raised their voices in agreement, and in that moment, a new purpose was born from the ashes of the old world. They called themselves the Remembrance, and they swore an oath that would be passed down from parent to child for 300 years without ever losing its power or its fury. The Velthory had tried to erase humanity from existence, but instead they had created something far more dangerous than anything their oracles could have predicted. They had created an enemy that would never forget, never forgive, and never stop until the debt of 7 billion lives had been repaid in full. And so the survivors began their work in secret, knowing that someday their descendants would finish what they had started and deliver justice to those who had wronged them so terribly. The stars that had once brought death would someday carry humanity's vengeance across the galaxy. And the Velthory would learn too late that some species are simply too stubborn to die. 300 years is a very long time to hold on to hatred. But humanity proved that some wounds cut so deep that even centuries cannot heal them or make them fade from memory. The galactic hegemony grew fat and comfortable in those long years, expanding its borders and crushing any species that dared to challenge the absolute authority of the Velthory ruling caste. They built monuments to their own greatness and wrote histories that praised their wisdom and mercy, conveniently forgetting the dozens of species they had erased from existence. To secure their power, the operation against Earth had been filed away in dusty archives and forgotten by all but a few historians who considered it nothing more than a minor footnote in the glorious story of Velthory expansion. But while the Empire celebrated its supremacy and grew lazy with the confidence of those who believe they have no rivals, humanity was doing something the galaxy would never have believed possible in the darkness beyond the mapped regions of space. Far from the trade routes and patrol sectors of the hegemony, the survivors of Earth had found their new home among dead stars and frozen worlds that no one else wanted. They called their hidden civilization the Reclamation, and every single person born into it grew up knowing exactly why they existed and what purpose they were destined to fulfill. Children learned the names of the 7 billion dead before they learned to read, reciting them in schools that taught hatred alongside mathematics and science and history. The colony ship that had fled Earth had eventually reached a small red star with 3 rocky planets, and there the first generation had established a foothold that would grow into something magnificent and terrible. They mined asteroids for metals and harvested energy from stellar remnants that the Velthari had dismissed as worthless, turning garbage into the building blocks of an empire designed for one purpose alone. Every resource went toward the goal of vengeance. Every scientific discovery was evaluated based on how it could be used to hurt the enemy. And every child was raised to be a soldier in a war that had not yet begun. The first breakthrough came 50 years after the plague, when human scientists finally cracked the secrets of faster-than-light travel by studying the wreckage of a Velthari probe that had wandered too close to their hidden territory. But they did not stop there, because matching the technology of their enemies was not enough for a species that planned to destroy an empire spanning 47 star systems. Human engineers developed a new kind of FTL drive that left no energy signature, allowing ships to move through space like ghosts that could not be detected by any sensor. The hegemony possessed they built weapons that the Velthari had never imagined, born from the desperate creativity of a people who knew they would only get one chance to strike and could not afford to fail gravity. Lances that could crush a warship into a ball the size of a fist. Phase torpedoes that passed through shields as if they did not exist. And swarms of intelligent drones controlled by artificial minds that learned and adapted faster than any living commander. Generation after generation added to the arsenal, each one building upon the work of those who came before with a dedication that bordered on religious devotion to the cause. The population grew as humanity spread across dozens of hidden worlds in regions of space the hegemony had never bothered to explore. And every new colony added its strength to the growing war machine. By the 200th year, the reclamation had a population of over 2 billion people living on 37 worlds, and every single one of them knew that their entire civilization existed for the sole purpose of one day delivering justice to the Velthari. Admiral Yuki Tanaka was born in the 273rd year after the plague, a direct descendant of Elena Tanaka, who had sworn the first oath of vengeance in that bunker beneath the Andes Mountains. She grew up hearing stories of Earth from her grandmother, who had heard them from her grandmother, who had heard them from survivors who could still remember the taste of real rain and the smell of flowers. Growing in sunlight, Yuki trained from childhood to be a warrior, excelling in tactical simulations and rising through the ranks of the reclamation fleet with a combination of brilliant strategy and absolute ruthlessness that impressed even the most hardened veterans. By the time she reached the rank of admiral, she commanded the respect of every officer in the fleet and the loyalty of soldiers who would follow her into the heart of a star if she asked them to. The final fleet was completed in the 300th year after the plague, and it was a thing of terrible beauty that represented 3 centuries of preparation and sacrifice. 12,000 warships of various sizes waited in the darkness, crewed by men and women who had trained their entire lives for the mission they were about to undertake. 400 million ground troops stood ready to descend upon enemy worlds, equipped with weapons and armor that would make them virtually unstoppable against any resistance the hegemony could offer. Admiral Tanaka stood before the Council of Remembrance in the Great Chamber, where the names of the 7 billion dead scrolled endlessly across walls that stretched higher than the eye could see. "We have waited 300 years for this moment," she said in a voice that carried to every corner of the vast room. "Our ancestors built this civilization from nothing so that we could be standing here today with the power to do what they could only dream of." She turned to look at the names flowing past, each one representing a person who had lived and loved and died because aliens had decided they were not worthy of existence. "The hegemony has forgotten us," she continued with a cold smile forming on her lips. "They think we are dust and bones, a species that troubled them briefly and then vanished into extinction like so many others." The council members sat in perfect silence, their eyes fixed on the admiral, as she spoke the words they had all been waiting their entire lives to hear. I am requesting authorization to remind them that humanity still lives, and to deliver the payment that has been owed for 300 years with interest that will make the galaxy tremble. The vote was taken, and every single hand rose in favor of war without a moment of hesitation or doubt. Admiral Tanaka bowed to the council and turned to face the doors that would lead her to the fleet waiting in the darkness beyond. "Then let us begin," she said as she walked toward her destiny and the destiny of two civilizations. The Valkyrie wanted to see humanity erased from existence, and now they will learn what it means to make an enemy of a species that refuses to die. The doors closed behind her, and the countdown to the greatest military operation in human history began at last. Grand Adjudicator Kethvos had ruled the galactic hegemony for 62 years, and in all that time, he had never once felt the cold grip of fear wrap around his hearts until the day the humans came. It had started as an ordinary morning on Velthor Prime, the capital world of an empire so vast and powerful that its citizens had long ago stopped worrying about threats from beyond their borders. Kethvos was sitting in his private chamber reviewing economic reports about grain production in the outer colonies when his aide burst through the doors without announcing himself or waiting for permission to enter. This had never happened before in the entire history of the High Council, and the Grand Adjudicator felt the first stirrings of unease as he looked up at the terrified face of his most trusted servant. "Your Excellency," the aide gasped as he struggled to catch his breath after running through the halls of the palace. "The orbital defense grid is detecting something we cannot explain, and the fleet commanders are requesting your immediate presence in the war room." Kethvos rose from his seat with a frown forming on his scaled face, wondering what could possibly have disturbed the peace of his empire so badly that protocol would be abandoned in such a manner. He followed his aide through corridors of polished stone and living crystal, passing servants who whispered nervously to each other as they watched their ruler hurry past with an expression of growing concern. The war room was a chaos of shouting officers and flashing displays when he arrived, and the Grand Adjudicator had to raise his voice to be heard above the noise. "What is happening here?" he demanded as he pushed through the crowd of military commanders who parted before him like water before the bow of a ship. "Explain this situation to me immediately, Admiral Voshtik." The Supreme Commander of the Hegemony Defense Forces turned to face him with eyes that held something Kethvos had never seen in a Valkyrie officer before, pure and absolute terror. "Your Excellency, ships are appearing in orbit around Velthor Prime," the Admiral reported in a voice that trembled despite his best efforts to control it. "But they are not coming through any transit point we have ever seen or recorded." The main display activated to show the space around the planet, and Kethvos felt his heart stop beating for a moment as he witnessed something impossible happening before his eyes. Ships were materializing out of empty space, appearing from nowhere as if they were stepping through invisible doors in the fabric of reality itself. And there were so many of them that the sensors could barely keep count. First there were dozens of the strange black vessels, then hundreds, then thousands. And still more kept appearing until the darkness around Velthor Prime was filled with an armada larger than anything the hegemony had ever assembled. "How many?" Kethvos whispered as he stared at the display with growing horror. "How many ships are there?" "Over 12,000 at current count, Your Excellency, and more are still arriving." Admiral Voshtik answered as sweat dripped down his face and his claws dug into the console before him. "We have never seen ship designs like these before, and our sensors cannot penetrate their hull material to determine their capabilities." The Hegemony Defense Fleet was scrambling to respond, hundreds of warships breaking from their orbital stations and moving to intercept the mysterious invaders who had appeared without warning. But before any shots could be fired, Every communication device on the planet activated simultaneously, with a signal that cut through all other transmissions. Like a knife through soft flesh, the display changed to show a human face. A woman with dark eyes and short, gray hair who looked at the camera with an expression of cold satisfaction that made Kethvos feel very small and very afraid. "This is Admiral Yuki Tanaka of the Human Reclamation Fleet," the woman said in a voice that carried across every speaker and screen on Velther Prime. 312 years ago, your species attempted to exterminate mine with a bioweapon that killed 7 billion of my people. Kethvos felt the blood drain from his face as memories of ancient history lessons surfaced in his mind. Stories of a primitive species on a small blue world that had been eliminated as a precautionary measure centuries ago. You recorded their deaths as nothing more than a bureaucratic footnote. Admiral Tanaka continued with hatred burning in her eyes like cold fire. You watched them die, and you felt nothing because you believed them to be beneath your notice. The war room had gone completely silent as every officer stared at the face of a species they had believed to be extinct, risen from the grave like an angry ghost demanding payment for old sins. "We have spent 300 years preparing for this moment," the Admiral said as her image looked directly at the camera as if she could see through it to the terrified faces of her enemies. "We have built our entire civilization around the single purpose of delivering justice to those who wronged us." She paused for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was as cold as the void between stars. "We did not come to negotiate, and we did not come to demand surrender or tribute or apologies that could never make up for what you took from us," she declared as her fleet finished assembling around the planet. "We came to balance the scales, and we will not leave until the debt has been paid in full." The transmission ended, and for one long moment, nobody in the war room moved or spoke or even breathed as the weight of what was happening settled upon them like a mountain of stone. Then Admiral Vostek found his voice and began shouting orders to his fleet, commanding them to engage the enemy and destroy these impossible invaders who had no right to exist. The first Velthari warship fired its weapons at the nearest human vessel, and the response was immediate and devastating beyond anything the hegemony commanders could have imagined. The human ship dodged the attack with impossible speed and returned fire with a weapon that twisted space itself, crushing the Velthari cruiser into a dense ball of metal and flesh no larger than a ground transport. More human ships opened fire, and the darkness around Velthar Prime lit up with the light of dying vessels as the hegemony fleet discovered just how badly they had underestimated the species they had tried to murder 3 centuries ago. Grand Adjudicator Kethvos watched his mighty armada being torn apart with terrifying efficiency, and he finally understood that the oracles had been right all along about the threat humanity posed, but the hegemony had not eliminated that threat when they had the chance. And now they would pay the price for their arrogance and cruelty. The Battle of Velthar Prime had begun, and it would not end until one civilization or the other lay in ruins. The Battle of Velthar Prime lasted 11 hours, and in those 11 hours the most powerful military force in the known galaxy was utterly destroyed by an enemy they had believed to be nothing more than dust and ancient history. The hegemony defense fleet numbered over 3,000 warships, each one crewed by trained officers who had spent their careers preparing to defend the capital world against any threat that might arise. But they had never prepared to face an enemy like humanity, because nobody had ever told them that humanity still existed or that they might someday come seeking vengeance for crimes committed centuries ago. Human ships moved through the Velthari formation like predators hunting prey, their weapons striking with precision that seemed almost supernatural to commanders who had never faced such technology. The gravity lances were the worst, twisting space around enemy vessels until the metal hulls crumpled inward and everything inside was compressed into a ball of matter no larger than a small room face. Torpedoes passed through shields as if they were not even there, detonating inside ships and tearing them apart from within while their crews screamed in confusion and terror-drawn. Swarms numbering in the millions swept through the battle zone, each one controlled by artificial minds that learned from every engagement and shared that knowledge instantly with all the others. A tactic that worked against the drones once would never work again. And Valkyrie commanders found themselves facing an enemy that adapted faster than they could think or react. Admiral Tanaka watched the battle from the bridge of her flagship, the Remembrance, as her fleet systematically dismantled the hegemony's defenses with cold efficiency. Casualty reports, she ordered, without taking her eyes from the tactical display that showed the positions of every ship in the engagement. We have lost 47 vessels so far, Admiral, her tactical officer reported as he monitored the flow of data streaming across his console. Enemy losses exceed 800 ships and climbing rapidly. The ratio was even better than their simulations had predicted. And Tanaka allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction as she watched another Valkyrie cruiser vanish in a flash of twisted gravity. But destroying the fleet was only the beginning of what needed to be done. And she had not spent her entire life preparing for this moment just to win a single battle. Signaled the ground forces she commanded as the last of the Valkyrie capital ships broke apart under concentrated fire from a dozen human destroyers. Begin the invasion as soon as the orbital defenses are neutralized. 400 million soldiers had been waiting for this order, packed into landing craft that hung in the shadows of the massive warships like insects clinging to the bodies of giants. They descended upon Velther Prime like a storm of metal and fire, punching through the planetary shields that the defense fleet had died trying to protect and landing in waves that darkened the sky. The Valkyrie ground forces fought back with everything they had. But they were facing an enemy that had spent 3 centuries perfecting the art of war specifically to defeat them. Human soldiers wore powered armor that shrugged off energy weapons and moved with speed that made them almost impossible to hit. Their reflexes enhanced by neural implants that had been refined over countless generations. They did not take prisoners from the military, and they did not accept surrender from those who had been responsible for the plague that killed 7 billion innocent people. Government buildings fell one after another as human forces swept through the capital city, hunting down officials and military commanders who tried to flee the justice that had finally come for them. Grand Adjudicator Kethvos was captured 3 days into the invasion, found hiding in a bunker beneath the palace where he had once ruled the mightiest empire in the galaxy. They brought him before Admiral Tanaka in the ruins of the High Council chamber, where the ceiling had collapsed and the walls were scorched by weapons. Fire. She stood among the rubble in her military uniform, looking down at the alien who represented everything her people had hated for 300 years. You are the leader of this empire? She asked in a voice that betrayed no emotion despite the weight of the moment. You are the one responsible for its actions. Kethvos looked up at her with eyes that had lost all their former arrogance, replaced now with the desperate fear of a creature that knows its death is approaching. I was not Grand Adjudicator when the operation against your world was conducted, he said in a trembling voice. I was not even born yet when those decisions were made by leaders who have been dead for centuries. Tanaka nodded slowly, as if considering his words with the fairness of a judge weighing evidence in a court of law. That is true, she admitted. You personally did not order the deaths of my people, and perhaps you would not have made the same choice if the decision had been yours. Hope flickered briefly in the eyes of the Grand Adjudicator, but it died quickly when he saw the coldness that remained in the human's expression. But your empire did this to us, Tanaka continued. Your government, your military, Your civilization made the choice to erase humanity from existence because we might someday become a threat to your power. She knelt down to look directly into his alien eyes, and her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Did you think there would be no consequences for genocide? She asked as centuries of accumulated rage burned beneath her calm exterior. Did your people truly believe the universe would allow them to murder 7 billion innocent beings and simply move on without punishment? Kefos had no answer, because deep down he knew that his species had committed a terrible crime and had simply never expected to face justice for it. We are not here to conquer your empire or to enslave your people, Admiral Tanaka said as she stood up and turned to look out at the burning city beyond the shattered walls. We are here to ensure that you never threaten another species again. The systematic dismantling of the hegemony had already begun, with human forces simultaneously striking at every major Velthari, military installation and government center across all 47 star systems within weeks. The infrastructure that had supported Velthari dominance for 10,000 years was reduced to rubble, and the ruling caste that had once commanded the fear and obedience of 200 species found themselves powerless, and alone the galaxy watched in stunned silence as an empire that had seemed eternal collapsed in a matter of months, brought down by a species that everyone had believed to be extinct. And through it all, the humans continued their work with the patient determination of people who had waited 300 years for this moment and intended to see it through to the very end. The galactic hegemony collapsed within 6 months of the human invasion, and with it fell 10,000 years of Velthari supremacy over the countless species who had lived beneath their rule without the military might that had enforced obedience and the bureaucratic systems that had maintained control. The artificial political structure simply fell apart like a building whose foundations had been removed. Client species who had been oppressed for thousands of years suddenly found themselves free for the first time in their recorded histories, and they responded in ways that varied from joyful celebration to violent revenge against their former masters. Old grudges that had been suppressed by Velthari power erupted across the galaxy as species settled scores with each other and with the remaining Velthari populations scattered throughout the former empire. Historians would later call this period the Great Fragmentation, a time of chaos and transformation that reshaped the political landscape of the entire galaxy in ways that would take centuries to fully understand. But humanity did not stay to witness the changes they had caused, nor did they claim the throne that the Velthari had been forced to abandon. Admiral Tanaka refused every offer of alliance that came from species hoping to secure human protection, and she rejected every plea for help from governments struggling to establish themselves in the ruins of the old order. We did not come here to become the new rulers of this galaxy, she declared in her final transmission to the assembled representatives of 100 different species. We came only to deliver justice to those who wronged us and to ensure that no one could ever threaten humanity again. The reclamation fleet withdrew to human space, establishing borders that were marked by warning beacons in every language known to galactic civilization. The message was simple and clear. No alien vessel was permitted to cross into human territory, and any attempt to do so would be met with the same devastating force that had destroyed the hegemony. But before they left, the humans did one final thing that would echo through the galaxy for generations to come. They released the archives. Every species in the former hegemony received complete records of Velthari atrocities gathered from government databases and military files that had been captured during the invasion. The files contained documentation of every pacification operation the Velthari had ever conducted, including the bioweapons programs and the systematic erasure of 17 sentient species over the course of 10,000 years. Species that had believed the hegemony to be harsh but necessary learned the true depths of Velthari cruelty. And many who had mourned the fall of the Empire quickly changed their views. The galaxy now knew exactly what kind of government they had been living under. And they knew exactly what humanity had done in response to being targeted for extinction. In the centuries that followed the Great Fragmentation, humans became figures of myth and legend throughout the galaxy, spoken of in whispers by species who had never seen one of these mysterious beings. Some civilizations worshipped them as liberators who had freed the galaxy from the tyranny of the Velthari, building temples in their honor and praying to them for protection against future threats. Others feared them as monsters of unimaginable ruthlessness, beings who had patiently prepared for 300 years to commit an act of vengeance so complete that it had shattered the mightiest empire in history. Most species simply avoided human space entirely, giving their borders a very wide distance and hoping never to attract the attention of a civilization that had proven itself capable of such patient and devastating fury on Earth, the birthplace of humanity that had been restored and rebuilt after 3 centuries of abandonment. Billions of people now lived under the light of a sun their ancestors had thought they would never see again. Cities rose where ruins had stood, forests grew where deserts had spread, and oceans teemed with life that had been carefully restored from genetic samples preserved during the dark years of survival. The Council of Remembrance continued to meet in a great chamber where the names of the 7 billion dead scrolled endlessly across walls that stretched from floor to ceiling. A reminder of what had been lost and why it must never be forgotten, new names had been added to the memorial. The names of every human who had fallen during the war of retribution that their ancestors had planned for 300 years. These heroes were honored alongside the victims of the plague, their sacrifices celebrated as the final payment of a debt that had hung over humanity for 12 generations. Admiral Yuki Tanaka retired from military service 5 years after the war ended, choosing to spend her remaining years on Earth, tending a garden that overlooked the ocean. She rarely spoke of what she had done, but she became a figure of reverence throughout human civilization. The woman who had led their fleets to victory and delivered the justice their ancestors had demanded in her final address before the Council of Remembrance. She spoke words that would be carved into monuments across human space and taught to every child in every school. For as long as humanity existed, we did not seek this war, she said, as she looked up at the scrolling names that represented so much loss and so much determination. We did not want it, and we took no pleasure in the destruction we caused. She paused to collect her thoughts, and when she continued, her voice was heavy with the weight of everything she had seen and done. But when an enemy tries to erase you from existence, you have only 2 choices, she declared. You can accept your fate and die quietly, or you can become something they cannot destroy. Her eyes hardened as she spoke the words that would define humanity's place in the galaxy for millennia to come. We chose to survive, she said. We chose to remember every wrong done to us and every life taken from us. And we chose to ensure that no one in this galaxy would ever make the mistake of underestimating humanity again. The chamber erupted in applause that echoed from the walls and ceiling, a thunder of approval from representatives who knew that their civilization had been built on sacrifice and sustained by determination. The galaxy had learned a lesson from humanity that it would never forget. A lesson written in the blood of billions and sealed with the destruction of an empire that had believed itself. Eternal humanity would not be threatened, would not be ignored, and would not be destroyed by anyone. And if anyone ever forgot that lesson, humanity would be ready to teach it again.